Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest is Erin Cline, an Assistant Professor of Chinese Philosophy and Religion in the departments of both Philosophy and Religious Studies. She came to the University of Oregon just this fall. Erin Cline earned her B.S. at Belmont University and her M.A. and Ph.D. at Baylor. She was a visiting scholar at Brown in the Department of Religious Studies. Her research interests include classical Chinese philosophy and religions and comparative religious thought. Her languages include Mandarin and Classical Chinese and also Spanish. She's now working on a book examining the idea of social justice in the Confucian Analects and how that might contribute to current discussions in ethics and political philosophy. It's just a delight to have you here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's a real coup for the university to have made this pioneering appointment in philosophy and religious studies, and so you are it. So give us for our audience out there who may not be aware, why is that pioneering? I mean, the Chinese have been doing philosophy for years and years. Why is it at a major university, research university, that somehow it makes news to have somebody teaching Chinese philosophy in the philosophy department?
Yeah, it's kind of puzzling, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because Chinese philosophy goes back so far.
Yeah.
And so, the origins of Chinese philosophy are, go back to the 12th century BCE and even further back, depending on what you want to conceive of as philosophy. But, the Western academy and universities have tended to exclude Asian traditions of thought from the discipline of philosophy. And philosophy is a little bit behind the rest of the academy, and including China and India and other parts of Asia in their studies. So whereas history and religious studies definitely include these traditions and teach them as part of their core, it's very new that the philosophers are just getting accustomed to starting to do this. And so it's great that the University of Oregon is helping to lead the way in that.
So I don't want to put you on the spot here, but what do you think it is about philosophy that's been particularly resistant to this as opposed to other disciplines? Is there any explanation?
Well, philosophy has been sort of resistant in a number of areas. Most well-known philosophers are white men, and so the feminists and African American voices have had a hard time getting heard as well. And so all of us are sort of a part of these, kind of on the fringes, and we're working at entering the conversation and being a part of the conversation.
Yeah. Well, it's great to have you here conversing with your colleagues in philosophy. So tell me, what first drew you to Chinese philosophy? When did you catch the bug, as it were?
Well, I really, I just sort of stumbled into Chinese philosophy. I stumbled into a course on philosophy because I was trying to fulfill my general education requirements. And I had started out as a music major and was doing vocal performance. And I took a course in philosophy to fulfill a humanities requirement. And it was taught as global moral cultures, looking at Islam and China and Japan. And I was just captivated by the way in which studying the ethical, philosophical traditions behind these cultures really helps you to understand the cultures themselves. And so I was always interested in cross-cultural dialogue because my dad was an anthropologist, and so I grew up in this home where it was important to look at other cultures and try to understand different ways of life. So I think that the course really resonated with a lot of my upbringing and the things that I was already comfortable with.
Where did you grow up, if you don't mind my asking?
I grew up in Homer, Alaska.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, which was a wonderful place, wonderful place to be as a child, spending lots of time getting an appreciation for the outdoors, as well as many different cultures that are a part of Alaska's heritage.
And this class, was it a large class? This class on global moral cultures? Was it a big class?
It was an introductory class, but it only had about 30 students in it, so it was pretty small for an introductory class. And at the end of that course, the professor made an announcement about the studies abroad programs going to China at the university. And so I started talking with the professor because I was a little bit interested in that, and I ended up going and studying abroad in China. And after that experience, which was just life-changing, then I knew that I wanted to devote my life to studying China.
So global moral cultures, and you say you did the I guess Islam and the Judeo-Christian traditions and
we actually
what
did,
else?
Yeah, Islam, China, and Japan. Those three.
Yeah, and so do you recall what it was about China that particularly grabbed you at the time?
Well, I think that one of the remarkable things about China is that it's had such an amazing impact throughout Asia. And the tradition that's really sort of at the core of that is the Confucian tradition with its emphasis on family and parent-child relationships and respect for parents and appreciation for one's family. And I was really interested in the way in which that sort of emphasis really differed from sort of a more individualistic emphasis that we find in our own culture. And so I wanted to learn more about that. And, you know, every college student, and actually every single one of us, is in the process of trying to work out our relationships with our parents. It's a continual process. And then relationships with our children and with our families more broadly. And the Confucian tradition has so much to say about that I think is really helpful in how do we navigate these relationships. And that really, I found that just really intriguing and very practically applicable.
What about Confucianism in China today? Is it, people say it's on the, well, it's kind of disappearing because of this new kind of capitalist framework. Do you think that's true?
Well, I don't really think that's true. I think that Confucianism, one of the amazing things about it is that it's survived despite explicit attempts to sort of stamp it out, you know, throughout many different stages in China's history. And China's had so many different forms of government and different kinds of rulers and leaders over the course of its history. And Confucianism has continued to define that culture and the cultures of East Asia more broadly, despite all those kinds of changes, economic and political. So I think that Confucianism is pretty adaptable, and I think it pretty deeply saturates East Asia. So, I mean, even though it will change with the times, and young people in China are finding new ways of adapting their values to fit a different kind of culture that's emerging. But I think Confucianism will continue to be an important part of that.
So that even if, say, young people haven't read Confucius, nonetheless, do you feel that there's something kind of fundamentally Confucian about the structure of Chinese culture?
Yeah,
Despite
definitely.
communism and industrialism and all that.
Yeah, and you know, it's such an interesting thing. I think one of the helpful things to do is to sort of talk to some Chinese people about this themselves and see what they think. I found myself sitting next to a young Chinese woman, just a few years older than me, on a bus once in China, and started talking with her, and she asked what I was studying, and I mentioned Confucianism, and she said, some of us in China, especially some of the young people, we may not be able to quote Kongzi to you, Confucius, but we know that Confucianism is our culture.
Wow, very impressive. Was this an educated person?
Yeah, she was a young woman who was in college, pursuing an advanced degree.
I think one of your teachers, was Roger Ames ever your teacher?
He was. I went to the University of Hawaii to start my graduate work. Studied with him there. Yeah.
Well, he's now teaching, as you know, in China, and he's saying, you know, he's of course a white European guy, Canadian, I guess, and he says he's sort of teaching these students about Chinese philosophy at Beijing University, the most prestigious university in China, and he's the one who's teaching them about this, it seems, for the first time. But I guess your argument would be it's in their blood, and in a sense he's kind of making them aware of things that are somehow still there very much in the culture.
Yeah, you know, one of the neatest things that I get to do is I get students, when I teach an Asian philosophy course, I get students who have maybe grown up in America or moved to America when they were very young, from China or from India. And what's fascinating is that they come into my class and study these philosophical traditions, and often after the class is over, they'll come up to me and they'll say, now I understand why my family is this way. Now I understand where all this stuff came from, and I never really understood it before. And so it's such a neat dialogue to be able to have with people of different backgrounds, ethnically and culturally.
Now, how comfortable are you with the sort of the idea that Confucianism or the Chinese philosophy is often included in a department of religion? Now, when you say, how comfortable are you with that term when it comes to the Chinese cases?
Well, one of the tricky things about Asian traditions in general, this applies both to India and China and Japan as well, is that their traditions can't be carved up quite as neatly as ours can. So whereas it's pretty clear for us that Christianity and Judaism and Islam these are religious traditions, and they have philosophical aspects and philosophical teachings, but in general, they're religious traditions. The traditions of Asia are both philosophical traditions and religious traditions. Confucianism is probably the one that's most clearly a philosophical tradition with some deeply religious aspects and religious practices. But Taoism is certainly both a philosophical tradition and a religious tradition. And I think it's important to look at both of those aspects of the traditions together. And it isn't even as simple as trying to say these texts are religious and these are philosophical, because really you're dealing with the same texts, and the same texts have been studied as philosophical texts over the course of Chinese history, but have also been used as scriptural texts and rituals. So that adds a layer of complexity to how to teach them.
So if you were going to talk about Confucianism as a religion, I mean, how might you, I mean, there are temples to Confucius, right? And
there are
Confucian temples.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean exactly? Can you let our audience know, what do people do when they go to Confucian temples? And do they go to other temples as well? Or once you're a member of a Confucian temple, do you no longer go to the Buddhist temple or the Taoist temple?
Yeah, those are great questions. I'm more comfortable not calling Confucianism a religion, but rather talking about the religious practices that are a part of Confucianism. So, for example, ancestor veneration, making sacrifices to one's ancestor, having a shrine, remembering who one's great-grandparents and one's grandparents were, meditating on whether they were moral exemplars and what we might be able to learn from their lives, and feeling a connection to them. The grave sweeping ceremonies in China are a Confucian ritual, part of Confucian religious practices. And then, of course, there are some religious beliefs in Tian, or heaven, which has some role in controlling the forces of the world, both the natural and in the human realm.
Well, tell us a little bit about what you mean by that as a religious / philosophical idea. Tian.
Tian. Well, one of the marks of distinction between kind of the central religious ideas in both Taoism and Confucianism is that they aren't theistic, in the sense that you don't have God sort of at the center of things and overseeing everything. Rather, you have some ideas that remain more mysterious, but it's clear that there's a force that's in control of things. There's a way that things are supposed to be. I like to think about humans sometimes are able to move in time to the Tao. They're able to move in time to the plan that heaven has for them. And so it's a matter of learning to live our lives in accord with certain rhythms. And it's clear that we're being watched over by certain forces in a positive sort of way. But that isn't as specific, and I think that the Chinese traditionally have been a little more comfortable with saying, there's a lot that we don't understand, and we don't have to have this really detailed, worked out theology when it comes to these ideas. We can say, well, we're finite, we're humans, and a lot is beyond our grasp.
So what about this question of, let's call it tolerance? I mean, if you do have at least some ritual aspects to Confucianism when you're practicing it in a temple, Taoism, how tolerant are these ritual people who perform these ritual practices to people who perform ritual practices in other spiritual or philosophical traditions in China?
Well, in general, in China, there's a great deal of what we call syncretism, which means that it's different traditions sort of being mixed up together and being seen as complementary. So it's not uncommon for a person in China to go and make some sacrifices, burn some incense at a Buddhist temple, and then go to a Taoist temple later that week and make some similar kinds of sacrifices. But within China, there are also people who would not do that. There are people who are pretty exclusivistic and pretty devoted to their traditions. Certainly people who live a monastic sort of life tend to be, pretty committed to one tradition. Sometimes they get a little competitive. I work with some Taoist priests there, and they will make very critical comments about Buddhism or Christianity or other traditions, and because they see their tradition as more true in a certain sense. But there tends to be a greater degree of syncretism in terms of combining different kinds of practices.
More than in, say, Western, I guess you'd call them Western religions that are practiced by Western people like Judaism, Christianity, Islam.
Yes, yes. Which, you know, if someone's a Christian, then we expect that they won't also say, oh yes, and I'm also a practicing religious Jew, right? We don't expect them to say, we would be like, what does that mean, right? That would puzzle us. But it wouldn't be as uncommon to see people, you know, combining traditions.
And so for you, I'm sure you reflected on that. What is all that about, especially, and it's seems to be a very important question to raise today when we see the consequences or in the combination of religious belief, particularly in the monotheistic traditions and violence. So have you reflected at all on what makes the Chinese religions different in that way?
That's an interesting question. Well, one thing that you can say, I mean, we often talk about the three teachings in China, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. And Buddhism was the foreign tradition that came from India. And so one thing to say is that Confucianism was more of a philosophical tradition than a religious tradition. So it never seemed as much like a competitor to Taoism or Buddhism. It seemed like something rather that could go along with them and provide some practical advice for living that was pretty compatible in a lot of ways with these traditions. Taoism and Buddhism are just intriguing because these two traditions have proven to be really adaptable in that they've spread throughout Asia and kind of become a part of many different cultures. And so I think both Buddhism and Taoism, it's hard to know what exactly someone practices or what tradition they're a part of when they say they are in one of those traditions, because there's so much diversity. I think definitely more diversity than we tend to find in a lot of monotheistic or Abrahamic faith traditions.
Now, you've been doing some field research, haven't you, in China? Tell us about your field research.
Well, I'm very interested in what contemporary Taoism looks like today in China. And so what I've been a part of an ongoing research project with a team of other scholars, and we go into Taoist communities, so we go and work with Taoist priests and worshipers in the Zhengyi tradition, which is a particular tradition of Taoism. And we observe rituals. We sit in the temples with the priests and listen to people who come into the temple asking for help, asking for religious advice or spiritual advice, similar to the way someone might come to see a priest or a rabbi or a minister in our own country and in some of our traditions. And and then we look at how these practices and beliefs and ideas relate to some of the ancient texts, like the Tao Te Ching. And those are the texts that I work with in a lot of my philosophical work.
When you say that, this group that you're involved with other scholars, you get together after you've been in a temple, say, and you observe something that happens on the very practical level, and then you go back home and you discuss where in the texts. Is that right?
We do, but we also do a lot of interviewing the priests and the people who are worshiping or who are participating in rituals, asking them, well, what do you think this means? What does this practice mean to you? And we get an important picture of Taoism there, because we learn what does it mean to the people who are part of that tradition.
You want to say something for our audience who may not have studied Taoism? Can you give them just a very couple of sentences on what it is?
Well, it depends on which tradition of Taoism you look at, but there's a common belief in something called the Tao, or the Way, which the Confucians also believe in, so it depends on what tradition you're looking at. But in general, the Taoists believe that all of creation can be a part of the Way, is a part of the Way, and humans need to find a way of moving within the Tao, being a part of the Tao, and living their lives according to the Tao, so that they'll be in harmony with the rhythms of nature. And they have a number of very distinctive conceptions of virtue and morality, and how humans should live their life in accord with the rest of creation, in accord with the Tao that goes along with that. They have a very optimistic view of human nature. And that's one of the marks of the Taoist tradition, especially the classical Taoist tradition, where they really think that we are initially born into this world, we're born good, and we're born in harmony with the Tao, but as soon as we're born, we begin to become a part of a culture, and we're told to cultivate ourselves and to work hard at becoming something that we're not. And the Taoists are worried about the damage that's inflicted on humans through some of those processes. So eventually what they say is, well, we were born into this world good, and then we journey away from the Tao, and then we have to work really hard to come back to it. So it's not that it's an easy path,
Right.
but it's one of returning. It's one of being estranged from the Tao and finding the Tao again, rather than finding it for the first time, finding salvation for the first time.
Now, the people that you have spoken with who are practitioners, do they themselves read the Tao Te Ching? Do they read other Taoist texts, Zhuangzi? I mean, what is there in a sense for them a kind of a Bible of scripture that they consult?
Yes, there is. There's a very large Taoist canon that involves many different kinds of literature, sort of like the Bible contains many different kinds of literature. And the Tao Te Ching is a ritual text, and many of the people can recite it from memory in the communities that I'm working with. They'll just start reciting it in classical Chinese, which is quite remarkable. So it's very much a part of their consciousness and their way of thinking about their lives. You might imagine the Psalms having a similar role in certain Abrahamic faith traditions. And then there are other texts that provide more detailed instruction about how to live your life and what to do if you get into certain kinds of problems or face certain challenges in life. They give very practical instructions for living.
So tell me something particularly surprising that you found out from doing this work of actually being with people who are practicing.
Well, the Taoist tradition that I work with, the Zhengyi tradition, has a very developed conception of hell that is actually something like the Catholic conception of purgatory, where people go to pay for their sins in this life before they're reincarnated into another life. And this is surprising. It was surprising to me initially, surprising to many Westerners, not only because of the interesting parallels that it has with certain, certain Abrahamic faith traditions, beliefs, but also because we tend to think of Chinese traditions as not having all of those sort of difficult theological beliefs that are sometimes hard for us to work out or believe in, that don't always jive with what we think about the world. And so, I think it's interesting to see that different traditions have emerged with different understandings but some of the same ideas.
And so, what is going to be the outcome of this in terms of, scholarly? Are they going to be publications, or what's the goal?
Yeah, we have published some articles discussing our research, and one of my main goals is in teaching, because I really there are kind of a select group of scholars who read the sort of work that I do. And I see some of the most important work that I do is in teaching students, what do people in China, how do they practice religiously? What do they believe today? And that's part of what motivated my research in China, is that my students often say, well, we're reading these ancient texts, Dr. Cline, but what do people really believe now?
Right.
And so I think it's great to be able to give people a sense of that.
Yeah. So the Taoist Body, is that
the Taoist
the Skipper,
Body, yeah.
the Skipper book.
It's a wonderful book.
So that's the kind of
by the only Westerner that I know of who's been ordained
as a Taoist,
in that particular tradition of Taoism.
And that's the kind of thing you're really trying to do, which is so valuable. That is to relate the ancient texts to the current situation.
Yes.
Yeah. And we certainly see that with the biblical text. They keep having resonance, so it's a very valuable endeavor. Tell us about your work in comparative philosophy. You're working on Rawls' theory of justice and Confucius, and I'm sure you've been asked this question many times. What is the value of the comparative approach?
Well, I think it depends on what ideas you're working with or what traditions you're working with. I think there are different answers to that question depending on who you're comparing. In the case of the Chinese tradition, one of the things I'm interested in my research is how do we raise children who have a sense of justice, children who grow up to become citizens who are willing to make sacrifices for other members of society who don't have as much as they have and who haven't had the same privileges others have had. How do we raise children who will learn to feel for others in that kind of way, who will be compassionate and have this set of virtues that are really important when it comes to being a member of a society with others who are less fortunate? And the Chinese tradition has a lot to say about raising children with a set of virtues, and in particular, the way in which parent-child relationships serve as a really important basis for moral development. And some thinkers in the Western tradition have discussed this. Rawls is one of them. But I think that the Confucian account in general is much richer in terms of moral development and the amount of emphasis and weight that it places on parent-child relationships.
Yeah, that's a fascinating observation. I mean, I guess you almost think of no philosophers that really talk about children. I guess Plato talked about children at the beginning of the tradition, but you'd think somehow it's hard to imagine Kant talking about children or Hegel talking about children. They're way, 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 way up here.
Right, right. Yeah, there's not nearly as much interest in those questions in the Western tradition traditionally. And so I think that the Confucian tradition has a number of contributions to make to our understanding of that.
Yeah.
But you know, in terms of comparative work, the contributions vary depending on what thinkers you look at. If you look at a thinker like Mengzi, an early Confucian thinker who came after Confucius, and compare him with Aristotle, they both Aristotle and Mengzi talk a lot about courage, and courage is a virtue. But Aristotle is strictly concerned with courage on the battlefield, the courage of soldiers. And for most of us, that really doesn't apply to our immediate lives, right? But Mengzi talks about moral courage. In other words, the kind of courage it takes to stand up and do the right thing when nobody else agrees, you know. And that's a little more applicable, you know, on a daily basis for us. So the same virtue, but discussed in very different settings.
Yeah. Well, do you think the Chinese philosophical tradition is, the vocabulary is less militaristic than say the vocabulary from Greek philosophy, where you have strategies, positions, I don't know, debate kind of on the model of a sort of duel or dialogue? I don't know. What's
the
what's
warrior
your sense?
in ancient Greece, you know, the warrior was really seen as kind of a paradigm. And that shapes a lot of the kind of language that a figure like Aristotle uses. Whereas the family was the paradigm for everything in ancient China. And so the family really is the starting place where the discussion begins. And that's a really different sort of place to start from. But you know, another difference with Chinese thinkers is that from the start they were more interested in the emotions and attitudes as well as the way that we use our reason. Whereas the Western tradition has tended to focus at certain times more on reason and less on emotion and attitudes and dispositions. Only recently has the Western tradition started to work on those things. So there's a little bit of a more holistic account of human beings and all the different capacities they have in the Chinese tradition.
Well, Erin, it was great to have you here, and we wish you lots of luck in the years ahead.
Thank you very much. It was great being here.
We've been speaking with Erin Cline, Assistant Professor of Chinese Philosophy and Religion at the University of Oregon. Thank you for watching.